our speakers for the seminar. Len Ismail, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. Andy Sumner, Professor of International Development at King's College London. And Stephen Klingebiel, Head of Inter- and Transnational Cooperation at EDOS. Len Ismail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody who has taken time to share this space and this conversation with us. We meet, of course, at very interesting times, and as I look across the room, it's nice to see former students, current students, Policy Center colleagues, like Isabel in the front row there. And of course, it's a wonderful opportunity for me to welcome Stefan and Andy to their second year at the Policy Center as colleagues and friends. We took this picture about a year ago outside this room, and a year in international relations and geopolitics does seem to go rather quickly. And we met maybe about 2 years ago at various events, and then I was invited by Stefan to speak at the 60th anniversary of his institute, which is the German Institute for Development and Sustainability. And along the way, it was very clear that we were meeting not just at interesting times, but at times which were moving very, very, very quickly. And it was important as well to start considering the way in which perhaps we could make a difference. We sensed very much that we were living in times in which the community, the international community, was very much in crisis. And really and truly what was at stake, what is at stake, is the future of multilateralism. And for those of us who work in development cooperation, the future of development cooperation. Because if there's not the trust that normally would be there, if there's not the general spirit of togetherness that brings people together, then what we lose, or what the potential for loss, is that we lose our ability to tackle some of the big ticket items like climate change, the global commons that require multilateral approaches. And what do we do about it? So we started a meeting over the past year when they came that started a particular process of lots of brainstorming, lots of video conversations in between the times that we were not together, lots of blogs, lots of writings, lots of publications, lots of conferences, and this one here today. So thank you very much for sharing this time with us. Along the way of our conversation, it was very clear that it was important to find like-minded others. And the issue of like-mindedness is very much one which becomes important as we think of the future of development cooperation, of what multilateralism will look like, no longer the universal type of multilateralism that we're used to in the past, but perhaps more narrow and maybe deeper in focus, less ambition, but nonetheless keeping that spirit of multilateralism alive. And we found very much that though we have different opinions, we are like-minded in terms of wanting a better future than perhaps we face right now. And so this issue of like-minded others, being engaged in conversations with people who want essentially the same thing, even though our perceptions differ. And we have brainstorming sessions where, in fact, our view of the world, the three of us, can be different. But we treat those differences really and truly, remarkably, in an atmosphere of mutual respect, dignity, and, in fact, space in which all ideas contend and all are legitimate. So it's such a pleasure for me to invite my colleagues to join us here today and to start a conversation around our most recent paper, which was published just a week ago. But of course it picks up on a previous paper on the issue or the notion or the concept of like-mindedness and what it means for the future of multilateralism. So it brings us here today to crisis or opportunity. And Stefan, a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you and good morning, and maybe it's even not too late to say Happy New Year. At least hopefully you had a good start into the new year. And just building on what Len is saying, we had some discussions over the last couple of months, and one main outcome I think is that sometimes, quite often, we have different views. And one view I want to present to you, and probably this is already quite familiar to you, but we want to highlight it, is that, and looking for the right word, northern, western actors might look at this situation as a situation with profound crisis symptoms, crisis symptoms. And you can look around to many leaders and many forums like the Munich Security Conference from last year, looking at what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is saying, or the European High Representative Callas, she's the European Foreign Affairs Minister, to say they all warn about this kind of crisis situation. This is a very common view, I think, at least in Europe. It probably also applies to several other countries, governments, which are associated with what we could call the North or the South. This is also related to what we see, that we have rising nationalist populism in a number of those countries, northern countries. I'm not going to highlight any specific country at the moment, but looking at the situation in Europe, looking at the situation in Northern America, etc., we see those things. And one aspect I want to highlight here is that populism is typically related to less appetite for multilateralism. This is a very common thing. We know populism is not just something for the North, but at least for this country group it applies. So saying that many actors are looking at the situation as a crisis situation, let me be a bit more specific, because crisis can mean many things. And we are trying to break up more specifically what might be interpretations of the crisis, the current crisis. And some of those crisis aspects are rather related to the very latest news we are reading every day, but some of those crisis symptoms were already there 5 years back, 10 years back. So in this regard, let me highlight some. Legitimacy crisis. I think one prominent example is looking at the United Nations. It's a place where all countries come with one vote, but we have some bodies of the United Nations which are a bit different, and we all know the UN Security Council is one of them. And we know that those countries around the world who are not permanent members of the UN Security Council perceive this as something what is not really up to date, because this was decided just after World War II, or even at the very end of the Second World War. So it's not reflecting the current situation of the world. Just looking at the African continent, Africa is not represented as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and we could all identify more examples in this regard. A second dimension of the crisis is the power shift and contestation of the existing global governance system. And we could also collect a number of different examples. One, of course, is looking at the BRICS group. We have the BRICS Bank, or the New Development Bank, which is to a large extent also contesting the existing structure of multilateral development banks, not at least the World Bank. So we have an alternative, so countries can turn not only to the World Bank or the regional development banks, but they can also turn to the New Development Bank. So it's some kind of contestation. We have a normative and fragmentation crisis to some extent, looking at those values behind multilateralism. We see that the understanding is even splitting up more compared to a situation 5 or 10 years back. Just look at key terms like democracy or multilateralism. I think most actors like to claim we are in favor of multilateralism, but the understanding is quite often different. Yeah, Russia is using the term, and China together, the term true multilateralism, which is, I think, quite different from the understanding on the European continent. It might be different from the understanding of the African Union. So sometimes even the same term might mean many different things. So this kind of normative setting behind is very important. We have institutional gridlock in many regards. Looking at many institutions, we could use again the situation of the Security Council of the United Nations, not able to find common ground on main ongoing violent conflict situations. And this is increasingly the case looking at the situation, for example, G20, G7, sometimes not even able to come to a final concluding declaration at the end of those meetings. And we have a proliferation and complexity of international organizations. This is to have an increasing number of international organizations is not something what is totally new. If you look at the situation from 1945 to today, it's more or less always increasing. There are nice indicators measuring it, but we see even a more dynamic in this regard, that we come up with more competing institutions in this regard. Let me come to my third and last slide. This is just to conclude. So traditional multilateralism, very much dominated to a large extent by Western, Northern actors after World War II, is very much under strain. We have also the view on those things are quite different. Is it something what is rather related to political and institutional challenges, or is it something where we need to find more coordinated solutions to global challenges like climate change? Len will introduce in a minute a very different view on this, but the main thing here I want to highlight is that this kind of crisis diagnosis is shaped very much by a positional perspective. If you were part of setting the rules, the norms at the beginning of the system we have, you might perceive this situation we are in a very different way compared to those actors who are rather newcomers for the last couple of decades. With this, I want to hand over to Len with a quite different view on the current situation.
Thank you so much, Stefan. The fact that the same sort of events sort of result in different approaches or different sentiments is perhaps not surprising at all. But I think what is surprising over the last several months is the sheer speed, the scope, and the depth of the changes that we see in the international structure and within the international community today. I think that the recent past will go down in an unprecedented way as perhaps the fastest moving in recent history in terms of changes within the international structure. And when I speak about the international structure, my students here will remember that what I'm really speaking about is the organization of power within the international global community. And Fatima is busy smiling. We have a sense very much of a world fragmenting into blocks. When Stefan spoke, and certainly when Andy will speak, we have a sense of normative values as well. But we sense very much the world fragmenting into blocks today around interest and interest groups and perhaps even ideological groups as opposed to a sense of values. We sense very much that the liberal world order that has been in place since the end of the Second World War, or since the end of the Great Wars, is under tension. We are facing in recent times an era of what we will call raw politics, and the politics of adaptation, because not everybody shares the same degree of power in this world. The global order is definitely under tension. Power dynamics are extraordinarily fluid today. And we have a sense of an international structure and international community very much in transition, where it will absolutely, or at the end of this transition end, is anybody's guess. We can speak of certain trends, but what we are doing today is not necessarily evaluating or extrapolating on these trends, but we can see very much that the center is no longer holding, that we're moving on to a different world order, the final contours of which have not yet been actualized. How did we get here? And there are different ideas about how we got there, but from the sense of the global south, there's very much a sense that we have gone through a series of crises. We've had COVID, we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've had the war in Gaza, we've had trade wars, we've had tariffs, sweeping tariffs all across the world, we've had major supply chain disruptions. One of the facts that we can say unequivocally is that regardless of where the crisis began, no part of the world has been unaffected by these series of crises, some much more so than others. And certainly we can expect that in the global south, the countries that are poorest, the communities that are most vulnerable, are the ones who have in fact been impacted the most. What have been some of the effects? We know that the World Bank and OECD have spoken about a decade of lost development for countries of the Global South. We know in our communities of the Global South that there are several countries that have in fact defaulted on their sovereign debt. We saw what happened in Sri Lanka when in fact that country moved closer and closer to bankruptcy. The government collapsed. And one of the differentiating factors between the Global South and the West, or the North, is the importance of development. Development is the single biggest threat, or the lack of development is the single biggest threat to the social, economic, and political stability of countries. And governments in the Global South are very much aware of it. So what do these countries want? They really want conditions of stability, okay, within which economic growth can actually take root again after all of these years of what I consider to be a period of rolling crisis. We got a sense of this fragmentation and the Global South actually moving away in a bid to secure its own interest when we saw the cool response of much of the rest of the world to the issue of sanctions. Sanctions which were not viewed as UN sanctioned sanctions on Russia. They were precipitated for compelling reason by the EU and the United States, but for the rest of the world, they did not see the sanctions as particularly serving their own interest. The invasion by Russia of Ukraine deepened tensions within the international community, and certainly this was unambiguously the case in 2024, in September, the end of September, at the UN General Assembly high-level meetings. Leader after leader after leader of the Global South took the podium to speak about an inconsistency of the application of the norms and values and the rules of the international order. They spoke about double standards. They spoke about a sense of hypocrisy. They spoke about a sense of overall betrayal. They felt very much that the international global architecture, including that of finance, was very much being used in a way that was inimical to their own interest, and very much in the newspapers, very much in scholarly works, we got a sense very much of a period of weaponization of some of the institutional architecture within which countries seek to secure their own interests and the future of their people. Very much we got a sense that this became a tipping point of a movement of the rest of the world away from the West. So for the first time, with the issue of sanctions, I remember being in Europe and the conversation being, but you know, we've started these sanctions, but that we look behind us at the rest of the world, but these sanctions are not being implemented. And this, I think, was the first time it was a little bit of a wake-up call. Hang on here a second. We're not all in this together. What the Global South wants, for example, as we've said, is conditions that would allow stability, economic stability to prevail so that growth could once again be part of the calculus within which countries seek to secure their interests. And certainly if we look 4 years back at the agenda of the G20, take a look at Indonesia, take a look followed by Modi, take a look followed by Lula, and so on, and then South Africa. All of these countries from the Global South have done one thing which is very important, in that on the agenda of the G20, they have put development firmly in the center of the conversation. Not war, not anything else, but development. How do we finance development? How do we grow the economies? How do we get stability again? And so even in the G20, we found a complete polarization of the countries of the Global South and the countries of the West. And now, of course, we, in the last year or so, it's not a crisis, but we do have a sovereign state acting to secure its interests in a much more robust, much more muscular stance, which has created some issues, not only for the rest of the world, but certainly within the West. And certainly we see the West, which normally we consider to be a very solid bloc, no longer acting in lockstep every step of the way. And that poses problems as well for the international community. But all of these crises have combined in some sort of a way to act in pushing the Global South to seek solutions to their own problems, to deepen construction of non-Western, pro-South blocs like the BRICS, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to do several things. One, to reduce the risk and exposure to Western institutional architecture, which they feel is hurting their ability to secure their interests, and also to increase their own resilience by shoring up their vulnerability, but in company with each other, solidarity. So, yes, it is a crisis because we see that the poorest countries are suffering the effects of decline of traditional ODA, the unraveling or dismantling of USAID have hurt certain communities in the South very, very badly. But countries of the Global South are no longer the countries that they used to be 40 or 50 years ago. They're countries that are richer. China has emerged also as a superpower, and their countries, the middle powers as well, have moved outside of their normal sphere of influence and are doing something which is very important for the Global South, in that they are seeding what we call in our class a mid-layer of multipolarity, which is providing greater choice. So countries of the Global South today are able to use this period of crisis as an opportunity to leverage the new international order, which is emerging, to seek better offers. Okay? All right. Crisis, so what is the Global South doing? And very quickly, they are deepening in a radical way South-South cooperation. The latest OECD reports show a decline across the board of ODA financing from traditional sources, not just in 2025, but in 2024, 2023, also because Western countries have different priorities which are pressing as well, and that money is being devoted more substantially to security and defense and other sorts of strategic interests for the Western countries. And the OECD points to South-South cooperation as the fastest element of growth of ODA today. It's not replacing, by any measure yet, traditional forms of ODA, but it is the fastest growing element of ODA today. We have expansion of the BRICS and SCO, which means that, in fact, in different continents, they are stitching up positions that they are able to bring to multilateral forum like the UNGA, like the WTO. They're building new institutions. The BRICS have also just unveiled last year a new entity to guarantee the risk of investment in poorer countries. The SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, last year as well, have unveiled a new bank to provide financing for new trade routes from different parts of the world, from Central Asia all the way into Northern Africa. They engage in currency swaps to make sure that the volatility that accompanies some of the currency devaluations in their countries do not take place, and so on and so forth. They purchase in oil and settle in their debts in local currencies. What they're doing as a bloc is shoring up their areas of vulnerability and dependence on an institutional architecture which they feel no longer is supportive of their development. So BRICS and SCO are expanding, of course, and as they expand, they are responsible for much more by way of global output, and they represent much more by way of natural resources in the world, not just in terms of geography. So we have new cross-border payment platforms and all of these things that we have also spoken about. Importantly, these countries today are exhibiting a stance of multi-alignment, as opposed with having to choose between North and South, East and West. They're multi-aligned, and as they speak to multi-alignment, they position themselves as working with everybody, but working not against anybody, okay? They're willing to work with all parties in every theater to better secure their interests. So it's an opportunity. This period, yes, it's a crisis, but in the Global South, is viewed very much as a strategic opportunity to address agendas which they have had from the 1950s. The non-aligned movement of the 1950s, these countries were already speaking of a new international economic world order based on more inclusion, more equity, and a world order in which Global South countries had more claim, more ownership over their natural resources and the ability to transfer those natural resources up the value chain to provide the prospects for greater development for their people. And why now? Why are we seeing all of these things happening now? Why? Because there are push factors, disillusionment with the status quo that is, and pull factors, the ability that today they can, because there's greater wealth in the great global South. China has traditionally been an ally of these countries, and they are leveraging this period to seek better offers. And the Global South agenda, just here very quickly, diffusion of global power. None of this has changed. A world order based on rules, but consistently applied. Reform of multilateral institutions, greater equity and inclusion. And today they're in search of genuine partnerships. Partnerships which are aligned with their national interest, that increase the role of national assets to allow them to move up the value chain, and pragmatic responses today to a world order which is fragmented. So, Andy, my friend, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invite. It's really nice to be here at the Policy Centre with colleagues, and it's a shame actually I can't stay a bit later on Sunday because it'd be really nice to be here where Morocco win the cup final. and really good luck to Morocco for that. Actually, the analogy with football is a kind of interesting one when you think about global rules. This, by the way, this is not in my PowerPoint, it's just in my head. Clearly, in football, you have a set of rules that the players follow, and if the rules aren't followed, then you have VAR to check who exactly broke the rules and a referee. The international system, to some extent, had those kind of rules and some sense of fair play, but I think that's kind of evaporated, as we've heard from my colleagues. So what I'm talking about is a little bit, is this a crisis or an opportunity? I think so 3 observations on the current situation and a kind of a consequence. I mean, we've heard already a bit about, clearly there's a very strong need for international cooperation at the moment. The number of global problems is mounting, and yet the kind of national politics in many countries may be pushing away from that. It's very easy to see signs of pessimism, and I think particularly around some thematic issues, it's very difficult to look for optimism. But on other thematic issues, there's more of a sense of hope. And what I'm going to come to in a moment is try and sort of map out that sense of hope a little bit with some empirical examples. The pessimism, I think, particularly around climate mitigation. Perhaps there's still hope around climate adaptation discussions and cooperation. Clearly, there was a low leader turnout at Belém, the COP. The maritime levy that was rowed back on, clearly signs that climate is a very difficult issue on the kind of mitigation side to move forward on. But then other issues, as we'll come to, perhaps small steps that can be quite significant, even though they seem small, particularly for the global south, may be important. And what we say in the paper is, we think there's almost a kind of evolution or redefining of multilateralism that's happening, whereby we think of multilateralism as a universal matter. Actually, definitionally, multilateralism is more than 3 countries doing something together, ideally cross-region, because then it becomes it's beyond regionalism. As we'll come to, I think particularly when we think about, I'm going to talk a bit about the Finance for Development Summit in Sevilla and some examples from there, the role of middle powers in pushing forward agendas around cooperation, I think, is going to be increasingly important. And this speaks to our earlier paper on like-mindedness too, I think. So what we think is multilateralism is shifting towards this kind of pockets of effectiveness. So this idea in research, some of you will be familiar, is that you can have a functioning pocket even if the system doesn't seem to be working very well. So you can achieve something in a certain small space. Originally, there was a paper by David Leonard. Prior to that, there was it was referred to as pockets of productivity by Darland, talking about the Brazil case, where originally it's from. So the idea is you have a kind of a space where progress is being made despite dysfunctionality elsewhere. So we think that's the kind of way things are moving. And let me say a little bit about Sevilla. So why speak about Sevilla? Well, this is one concrete example of cooperation in the new era. Why is it a concrete example? First of all, the US stepped back. It was negotiating, but then withdrew. And in some ways, that created an opportunity for others to develop some more ambitious type mechanisms. There's a whole set of mechanisms around debt servicing that are very concrete. I mean, it remains to be seen if they're fully implemented, but they certainly have plans. They have agencies, managerial leadership, and actually, the conference itself came up with over 100 concrete initiatives. Of course, you have to see what happens over the next few years. And although these they don't solve the problem of debt servicing, which is very acute, particularly amongst the poorest countries, but across the global south, in the legacy of all the debt that was taken on during the COVID period, but earlier as well. I think what they illustrate is this idea that you can have coalitions that come together and form these kind of pockets of effectiveness, even when the wider system seems to be more fraught. So let me tell you a little bit about those examples of those initiatives. In the paper, and actually in the new paper we're working on at the moment, we pick out some of the kind of those focuses on on debt service. Okay, so debt service is a very politically difficult issue, multiple interests, asymmetric power, and yet Sevilla developed a range of initiatives that at first instance seem quite small, but then actually when you look at the detail, they're actually quite important and may lead to a shift in agency for Global South countries in these venues. I mean, the ones we pick out or have picked out in the past and in future work, the Borrowers Forum is a venue for Global South countries to set joint negotiation positions. I think in terms of agency, that could be very important. The Global Hub for Debt Swaps is going to standardise debt for climate, debt for SDG swaps. I think could be very important. And then finally, the debt pause clause is very interesting because it's a standardisation of debt payments after external shocks like hurricanes and so forth. This has already been extended to 70 countries by the European Investment Bank. So I think actually, although these are actually very small examples in the wider picture, they are of importance and significance. And they seem to have a set of ingredients around them, which is some kind of top-level sponsorship, usually a mixture of Global North and Global South middle powers. They tend to have salient goals. They have a capable managerial core, which is usually some international agency or a bit of an international agency. And they align the external support with domestic incentives. They may not be proportionate to the huge extent of the debt servicing problem, but nevertheless, they are quite important small steps towards making debt servicing a little bit more manageable. So actually, they give you a sense of hope that within a wider context of contestation, certain kind of progress is possible. And so what does this actually mean in terms of a kind of new architecture of cooperation? So I think it shows what's possible, but it also shows the risks and the trade-offs. So it shows that global cooperation -1 is possible, but it also shows there's a shift from kind of comprehensive universalism to a kind of modular instruments, specific tools dealing with specific problems. And though that might not be the great sort of lofty ambitions that you want for an international system, in the current context, I would argue it's a progressive step. So it's multilateralism, but with limits. So the trade-offs and risks we see are, first of all, questions of legitimacy, questions of fragmentation, questions of inequality, and then questions of whether it really solves the problem. I'll just say a little bit about each of those and then draw some conclusions. So the legitimacy risk is really about whether the exclusion of some participants raises question marks about the legitimacy of the endeavour. Okay, and I think that remains something that depends on whether other countries join these initiatives. So at the moment, a set of countries have joined each of these debt initiatives, for example, and the door is left open, which is quite interesting. So other countries can join, but it remains to be seen whether they will join. Then also in terms of fragmentation, the kind of minilateralism that this implies might lead to a kind of hollowing out of multilateralism. So you get authority diverted away from universal bodies into these minilateral approaches. Thirdly, I think there's issues about inequality of voice in terms of the countries that are involved and who benefits, the limitations on participation, unless countries are able to join these initiatives. And then finally, I guess this is the underlying question in this way of thinking is, in the current context, this is positive. This is a kind of step forward. This will make the problem slightly more manageable, or maybe noticeably more manageable. But it doesn't solve the problem that a universal multilateral agreement might solve. But in the absence of that being possible, it actually manages sort of some kind of tangible multilateralism or cooperation to start to address the issue. Of course, all of this is with the caveat of whether it's implemented to what extent. Actually, one interesting thing about the Sevilla plan is there are a lot of implementation plans. And so there's a certain level of optimism or confidence that these kind of modular instruments will come to fruition in the sense they have lead agencies and they have political coalitions behind them, again, emphasising the middle powers. So what to conclude from this? I mean, rather than thinking about crisis and opportunity, what my colleagues have pointed towards is kind of, whose crisis is it or whose opportunity is it? So I think for the Global South, there is an opportunity to increase agency in terms of reshaping the architecture, although with boundaries, of course. And one of the most important boundaries is probably the thematic question. One of them, in a way, the kind of existential crisis that climate poses is going to remain a very difficult issue to move to make progress on. But debt servicing is, for many countries in the Global South, is draining resources. People often talk about the drain of resources from health and education, but you should also remember it's draining resources from economic development. Those resources could be used for infrastructure. They could be, it could increase the kind of the growth and the government revenue in future. So actually, when you think about debt servicing, I'd push you to think more about economic development as well as social development. There's also, I think, for middle powers, there's an opportunity to take leadership, and I think in Sevilla you could see a lot of middle powers coming forward to do that. Not only from the Global North, but also from the Global South, particularly the big populous countries in the Global South. What kind of... I started using this term flexilateralism. It sort of seemed to stick in my head. What would be the design principles you would want in place? Firstly, I think there's something about having clear boundaries. So modular instruments in cooperation need to have a clear thematic area and goal. They're not vague, they're very specific. They're very defined, they're very much tools, policy tools. They typically have measurable outcomes, and often very much a sort of transparent setup. There's also a permeability, so countries can join, even if they don't join at the beginning, which I think is really interesting for corporations. You gradually build it out. I think that's interesting. And they tend to have a normative alignment with the underlying values of multilateralism, of countries working together. So what I think I would conclude from this is there are signs of hope around certain thematic areas. Cooperation proceeds, even in a difficult environment. It's defined as more polycentric, and that's positive. It's more club-like, and that is positive, but it also may have trade-offs. It has a very particular role for middle powers, as I've mentioned. And also, it might be much more experimental in the sense of there's no guarantee it's going to be successful, but if it's specific enough and implemented with a specific agency, then it has the potential for hope, I think. It's very much based on specific issues and problem solving rather than sort of general or vagueness. And then I suppose the kind of the underlying question is it enough? I guess my view would be in the current context, it's pretty good and it's positive and it's keeping countries speaking with each other and working on an important issue like debt service. Its limitations clearly are around some of the really big issues. I mentioned climate. There's also issues around sort of managing technological change and the power of, the impact of AI that we'll have, around the world, particularly on global inequality. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Stefan. So here we are, and over to you. I think you've heard quite a lot from us in the last 30 minutes. And I'm hoping, of course, that you came prepared to engage interactively with us. So we're happy to take any questions or any comments that you might have. And indeed, we have 50 minutes within which to occupy our time. So please, the floor is yours. Yes, you were smiling and I thought we might as well just start. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, shall I stand?
Yes, you start.
Okay.
Well, you can stand or sit, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fatmata Jabi. I'm from the Gambia, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the university in political science and global studies, focusing on Morocco's educational public diplomacy in Africa. When it comes to, I have a comment, maybe at the end it might be a question, I'm not sure. We'll see where it goes. Talking about multilateralism, especially in this day and age, is a very tricky situation. We've seen that, well, from my side, at least, I'm not going to speak for the global south, but multilateralism, at the beginning of his talk, he said that it's in a very profound crisis. But from my standpoint, in observing what is happening, it's not only in profound crisis, but multilateralism is threatened by the West. And when I say that, we know from the first time of you know who, the T word, he exited so many international organizations. And just on the 7th of January, he exited from 66 international organizations, 30 of which are from United Nations. So when you look at how things are going, it's a really crazy time. However, while it's in crisis, there are opportunities as well. And we've seen that China and the role of middle powers trying to fill that gap. And where we are seeing things are going now, I think there's a huge gap, but that's where Europe or middle powers, especially within Asia, have a greater opportunity. So my question is from the side of the Europeans. How do you guys see this right now, since there is obviously a divide between the US and Europe? And I'm also surprised to see that maybe none of the panelists talked about the national security strategy, which is sort of far from what we're talking about. But it's really closely related to how perceptions are being viewed. Sorry for taking a lot of time.
Not at all. I mean, I think this is fascinating and interesting. Unless somebody has a question right away, the gentleman from Reuters,
hello,
Reuters,
Hamid
yes.
Jishtimi, journalist. Thank you. Thank you for this very timely conference. I have a question about development aid and how the erosion of multilateralism and the erosion of rules-based order and the emergence of alliances led the West to cut much of its aid to Africa, because some of these states paid the price of their alliances. So most of the EU cut aid to Africa. Do you see this as a trend that is set to continue? It's actually a sort of weaponizing development aid. This is on the one side. On the other, I have a second question, if you don't mind. Speaking of multilateralism, requires still a leader, someone to guarantee this. Multilateralism collapsed when the US stopped acting as a leader, because a leader sets the rules and respects them. Now the US acts as a hegemon. It sets the rules, it violates them. Why? Because the world is no longer unipolar. When we say the global south, is actually an euphemism for rising global powers that are competitors of the US. So are we heading to a world of alliances instead of multilateral pockets? An alliance is based on sort of offensive realism instead of genuine cooperation. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think those two interventions are heavy enough for us to say, let's take a pause and invite my colleagues to respond. But the one point I would make, it's not an answer to you, but just to say we speak about the United States, which is a sovereign state, which in fact does have the right to secure its interests in the way that it chooses. The United States represents 4% of the world's population. Europe and the West, 12% of the world's population. So we have, if my math is correct, something like about 85% of the rest of the world. So a question I would throw back, even whilst my colleagues are formulating their response, is, well, what is the rest of the world willing to do in support of the future which they want, okay? So please, Andy, Stefan, which of you are willing to go first? And in response to either one of or both of these very interesting observations.
Yeah, thank you. Great questions, comments, and stop me if I take too much time, but many things to say. Yeah, first of all, this kind of situation we are facing, you're absolutely right. This is a quite different situation we have now, but I think one main message we wanted to bring over, how you assess the situation depends on where you are based. Yeah, it's a country, it's your own background, all this. So as somebody coming from Gambia, this is exactly what Len was saying. It might be also perceived as an opportunity. Yeah, I think in Europe we are much more Trump focused compared to those academics based in some Asian countries, for example. That makes a big difference. And so this situation is seen, and this is why we also talk about it, seen as an opportunity. But what I also want to say is we are using those labels like Global South, West, North, etc. But this is a bit too easy, we know it. The situation of Gambia is very different from South Africa, it's very different from India or China. So Global South actors are not all the same, and Western or Northern actors are also not the same. So how a small Pacific island is looking at climate change might be very different from China, for example. So yeah, this kind of situation, US is withdrawing from many international organizations. Yes, this is a big splash in a way. This new announcement, I think, at least from my perspective, was not in a way a big surprise, because this was very clear from the very first day in office, 20th January last year. The only question was what are the organizations the US is going to leave in a way. And from my personal view, and we might have different views on this, if the US is not any longer at the table, might be sometimes also an advantage, because from what I personally see is we have a number of international organizations and platforms where the US administration is trying to undermine those institutions from within. And this is not always helpful. So sometimes it might be even better to have a situation where like-minded actors are sitting around the table and think about solutions. Development cooperation, development policy, yes, we have a trend where traditional aid is going down in a very significant way. It's the United States, but we have not the same level of decline, but a very significant level of decline also in Europe. Yeah, France, UK, Germany, and others. And it's not just the amount of ODA, but it's also the way how it's allocated. So much more in interest of those providing countries. Yeah. Migration, security, all these things. So the nature of development cooperation is changing very much. What I find always interesting is looking at many discussions. I think a number of ODA providers would say China is so dominant now in many regions of the world, not at least on the African continent, with South-South cooperation, with the Belt and Road Initiative. But the conclusion is not, let's invest more in North-South cooperation. The conclusion is, let's reduce it. And for me, this is not a very consistent way. So if we complain about the dominance of what China is doing, why is our conclusion we provide less resources in this regard? Yeah? My last point, just quickly, yes, US or the leader should set the rules and respect them, and we have a different situation nowadays. I think this kind of pockets of effectiveness, what Andy presented, is one, not the total solution, but might be one part. This kind of like-mindedness, that was the previous paper, I think is something what we are really in need of, because I think just looking at Europe, looking at other regions and country groups, we still have a lot of power because of the number of people living there, the economic size, all this. Even small countries are powerful to some extent. We have a collection action problem. That's the main thing. So how to overcome collective action issues is one aspect. And one other aspect related to it, I think, and not just because of Trump, but even before, we need to have more mixed groups. Yeah, sometimes it might be good to sit together with a group of very like-minded countries. Sometimes it's not helpful to have this kind of only Southern, only Northern identity. Yeah? G77 in the UN, I think it's good to have this group, but sometimes it's also good to step a bit beyond those identities and bring together those who accept climate change as a real threat to the world. And regardless of whether your identity is a Northern, a Western, Eastern, or something else identity. And I think we need to find more ways how to create those mixed groups. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And Andy, we will go right over to you. But I think just to follow off from your point, Stefan, what we have found in our research for our paper, and Andy touched on it, is that we are finding those middle powers, both North and South, actively, constructively working together, right? So we have Germany working with Brazil, post-Belém. We have Luxembourg working also with Brazil and South Africa after the G20, and so on and so forth. So we see in the middle powers, both North and South, sort of presenting themselves as bridges across either ideological divides or some other types of divides, but in a way which is really constructive. And I think one of the things we were looking at is, well, is this a moment? Is this a movement? Is this real traction? Over to you, Andy.
I'm not sure the answer to that question, because in my mind I already was thinking about what am I going to say to the other questions, but I'll come back to yours in a moment, I promise. Just on the first question, well, there was a few parts to it. I mean, originally there were over 200 organizations on the list that the US was thinking of leaving, and that was what was in the public domain, and that was somehow reduced to 66. So the question on my mind is, why did the 134 organizations, why did the US remain in those organizations? And you can speculate, but my guess is partly there's what resonates with Stefan was saying, there's an attempt either to disrupt, and there's an attempt to try and push those organizations. It seems to be there's a real thing for the US administration to push organizations back to core mandates of economic development. And so perhaps there's something about the organizations that didn't get left have a much stronger sort of economic development focus, but there's also an issue about trying to disrupt them as well, I think. So there's a question mark there for me, and I think even nationalist politicians need some international cooperation, because there's certain issues that either you can project externally onto the world stage of your back to a domestic audience, but also you need to produce tangible, nationalist politicians need to produce tangible results, like all politicians, in order to sort of, strengthen their domestic base. So I think there's a question there for me, why the US remained in so many organizations, even though it left 66. And then the second part of the question was really about the national security strategy. For me, there's a question about what will be the developmental effects of that. You probably saw the front of the Economist this week with the kind of Monroe or Dunroe doctrine. And this actually comes back to the question about ODA, actually, and aid, particularly for Africa. I think it's not yet clear first of all, it's not yet clear that the US can only focus on the Western Hemisphere. I think, I wonder whether that's possible. So it begs the question about, that's the higher priority, there's a set of priorities, but the US will still have some focus beyond the Western hemisphere. And then it begs the question about, I mean, you see the kind of the discussion in Congress, it relates to ODA as well, whereby, you know, Congress has pushed back on some of the ODA cuts, where that money will be spent, I think. So there's kind of, what will be the development impact of the national security strategy, I think is still a little bit, it needs a little bit kind of exploring. I'm not completely sure myself. On the ODA, or the aid side of things, I guess there's 30 or 40 countries where aid really matters, i.e. the withdrawal of aid will have some very significant human suffering. It may even destabilize some governments who rely on those resources. Most of the Global South, ODA doesn't really matter because domestic resources have grown and grown and grown with growth over the last 20 or 30 years. I think there's the challenge is going to be for the very poorest countries, the countries that maybe are seen as not geopolitically significant. You know, where what happens to them, or you know, who provides external finance or to support those countries? That's the big question. My guess, and I don't know what colleagues think, my guess is that ODA, we're moving away from an ODA world towards something around the mobilization of private capital and maybe the use of ODA to mobilize private capital. I'm not quite sure what that means precisely, but one example might be the bits that the Trump administration has retained from its development operations are the bits that relate to US companies investing overseas, particularly around critical minerals. So is it that ODA is moving towards this much more kind of support to business type model? I'm not quite sure, but something that seems to be the way the US is going. Actually, underlying that is there are now 3 or 4 different ways of thinking about ODA. One is the kind of much more nationalist agenda where ODA is somehow related to a rate of return. I think that's the way the US is seeing things now. So what's the rate of return to US taxpayers of spending money on ODA? It begs the question about what ODA actually is, because if ODA is about subsidizing American business to invest for critical minerals, that's not the way a lot of people see ODA, actually. What's the developmental impact? I'm not quite sure. Clearly, there would be resource revenues for the host government, but it's not quite how ODA has been seen in the past. But that's just one way of seeing. The other way of seeing ODA is the kind of, I think the approach the European Union is taking is much more about a kind of strategic multilateralism of choosing a development policy around specific sets of countries that matter to the European Union. So it's less about domestic countries' needs. It's more about the connection with the EU strategic strategic competition with China and the US, effectively, and how does ODA fit into that kind of pattern? And then, there's also a kind of sort of, I think there's still a group of countries that are pushing a much more solidarity type ODA, the kind of, I suppose, as ODA has been seen traditionally. And then, as Len mentioned, South-South cooperation has grown over the years. It's not as big, it's nowhere near as big as traditional ODA, but perhaps in the future it will grow and continue to grow, particularly from the very large southern providers. And so you might end up with a much more pluralistic type ODA framework where ODA can mean multiple things to different governments rather than the kind of traditional model that's been much more kind of OECD, DAC focused of this counts as ODA to countries trying to push the boundaries on what ODA actually is or what it's supposed to do. I think that's the kind of the question in the air. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I think that there's just one comment that I would make on the whole subject of ODA is that what happened last year with the dismantling, let's say, of USAID and the retreat from ODA of so many traditional donors. But by retreat, I just mean divergence of funding away from what we would normally call ODA, okay, was a shock to the system. But there's another view of it as well. It was tough, but it was timely. There were many questions being raised about ODA and the fact that development partners or donors may not have been explicit about their interest. Interests were never on the table. But ODA was not always just about altruism. It came with strings attached, but those strings were never explicitly discussed. What the new or the second iteration of the American administration in place right now has done is to put those a transactional approach to where my money is going on the table. But subliminally, that conversation was already there. It's just that it was now in everybody's face, which is why my own sense has been that it was tough, but it was timely. It was time for the development community to have real, frank, and honest conversations about the future of development cooperation, where support for the most vulnerable was going to come from, making space for the new development actors on the global stage, and including them around the table in the conversation about the future of development, not just saying, you are wealthier, we want your money, but we keep you out of the room when we're talking about the design of a new architecture. So there are many dimensions to what has happened over the last, or the recent past, and I think it is time that South and North and East and West sit down and have a conversation about the future based on interest, and interests differ, and that's fine, but based on honest and frank exchanges. I think that everyone benefits from that. So, please. Is someone in the room with the mic, please?
Hello, thank you for this presentation. I just have like a comment.
Sorry, and who are you? Please, can you introduce yourself?
I'm Atpi. I'm an entrepreneur. I work in the food tech. Okay, so I have a comment or maybe a question. I was thinking about the multilateralism, and multilateralism requires the cooperation of several actors. And the more actors they are, the more the efficiency or productivity of and taking decisions becomes harder. So when we talk about the global south, we talk about a lot of countries and a lot of actors, and so to be competitive and have a leverage, the global south needs to align different perspectives, different vision. The UN and the international organization, they already suffer from this, from the bureaucracy, from taking time to make policies. So how is this global south? How can it like have a better? How can it be efficient in taking decisions and maybe building fundamentals of new fundamentals of global organizations, Especially that when we talk about the global south, when we talk about Africa and a lot of countries, we have like an issue, a crisis regarding transparency and corruption. So this is what we. This is what populists or nationalists have against the UN and the international organizations. So how can we build like this trust back, and how can we ensure that we really build new fundamentals that align with human rights and equity and everything.
Not easy questions in that observation, but before I invite my colleagues, I would just introduce you to my colleague, senior fellow, Isabel. Isabel is an agricultural economist, and you're working in food issues and food security. So during the coffee break or afterwards, find Isabel. She has all the answers to issues of food security and the global south and agricultural transformation. She's a good person for you to know. So we have 1, 2, and 3, and 4. But I see my colleagues taking notes, so they will respond to you. So please. Oh, I'm sorry. This gentleman has the mic, and then we move the mic to the back, please. Please, sir.
Well, let me, my name is Mohamed Hamidouche. I'm a former vice president of the African Development Bank. So I was involved all my professional life in multilateralism, on managing ODA, etc. So I would like to congratulate both of you for your brilliant presentations, and the issues that you have addressed are not simple. So they are on the table within the international community. ODA has two facets, bilateral and multilateral. So we have to make the distinctions between the two. Number two, what you have not addressed is the emerging regional organizations like the African Development Bank or the Afrexim Bank, the African Import-Export Bank, or the regional development banks like West Africa Development Bank, etc., etc. Today, there are two issues. ODA is being replaced by the private sector. And the private sector in Africa is also buoyant. They are heavily involved through implementing infrastructure or investment projects under the PPP schemes, private-public partnerships. You have also the Arab Coordination Group, composed of 10 major financial institutions, including OPEC Fund that is based in Vienna, etc. If you have noticed what happened in December in London, where issues were discussed regarding the replenishment of the soft window of the African Development Bank called the EDF, the African Development Fund, similar to the IDA, the affiliate of the World Bank, etc., where 11 billion US dollars were raised outside the traditional ODA donors, including some sub-Saharan African countries who also started contributing financially, you see, to the replenishment of that soft window that address less developed countries in Africa. There are about 44 countries, you see. Three, the Islamic finance is also being used more and more through sukuks, that they are replacing the bonds, you see, that you can raise in the international capital markets, etc. Lastly, you have also the diaspora, remittances. Let me give you just one example. If we take the example of Cabo Verde, the remittances they are just 1 million people outside the country and 500,000 you see in the country. The remittances represent 900% of the foreign ODA received by the country. So the first donor is not the donors, the traditional donors, but the Africans themselves. So I think that we have to take into consideration all these issues. Now, the debate, you see, you have been talking about democracy, the instability, development is key. One last point. I have been involved in drafting a book with the AU on the fiscal evasion by multilateral or international companies operating in Africa. Just two figures. On average, the amount of the ODA that Africa received every year amounts between $50 to $60 billion, while the fiscal evasion represents $1,750 billion. So if these companies are paying their due to our countries, we can jump the ODA and we will not ask for it. So that is the real issue that we need to address in the future. And maybe you see what Morocco is doing also in sub-Saharan Africa, etc., through the Royal Atlantic initiatives to assist the landlocked countries in the Sahel region, etc. We have this Morocco gas pipeline also that is heavily involved, you see, in empowering Africa. In West Africa, in the ECOWAS countries, you have 50% of the population do not have access to power, etc. So the soft power of countries like Morocco, you see, can help also to increase the South-South cooperation, and I think that this is the future for all of us. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for having been
Not
long.
at all. Very, very valuable. Thank you very much, sir. And I personally will respond to one or two of those issues because you're definitely right on target. Please, the young lady at the back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this timely, thought-provoking seminar. My name is Professor Hasnaoui Yasmin, Professor of Social Science at Hassan First University. So as you might rightly put it, that we are currently, witnessing a convergence of global crisis. You name them: geopolitical fragmentation, protracted conflicts, economic uncertainties, and declining trust in international institutions. At the same time, the global power is increasingly dispersed in state regions and non-state actors, contributing to what we call, polycentric world order. So, for many countries in the global south, these shifts intersect with long-standing concerns. In this context, do you see challenges to multilateralism as a crisis of effectiveness, a crisis of legitimacy, or necessarily an adaptation to polycentric or polycentrism? Thank you so much.
There was, yes, this gentleman.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this wonderful morning. My question would, I will end up with a question, but I would like to talk a little bit about multilateralism. And I have, my opinion is that multilateralism has always functioned on, in hierarchical terms. I mean hereby these structural inequalities between the countries involved. And of course, the best example for the moment is the case of Greenland. How is one NATO member trying to annex Greenland with the presence of other NATO members? My very simple question is what lessons can the Global South draw from the case of Greenland? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, Hamza? And then the gentleman.
Thank you very much. My name is Usama Taibi. I'm a researcher here at the Policy Center for the New South. My question goes to Professor Sumner. So I like this idea of pockets of effectiveness, but I think it's built on the premise that states, no matter big or small, have a space to exert some form of agency. But what happens if, just like some predict now, we're moving towards where we have spheres of influence, where, like they say, the powerful do what they can, and the weak endure what they must. So, what happens if in this polycentric world where we have spheres of influence, great powers carving those spheres of influence, countries no longer have space to exert their agency. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gentleman there in the front, and then...
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to ask the question. My name is Omar. I'm a PhD candidate in economics and public policy. And my question is the following. Amidst this huge global disorder disruption, is the shift toward multilateral cooperation only a temporary urgency measure, or will it become the main paradigm by which global cooperation operates? And if not, is there any tangible way to go back to a balanced and unified and coherent global order? And is that even desirable? Thank you so much.
Okay. There was somebody at the back. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for this great conference. I have a question about changes that happen after the COVID, because as a journalist, I'd noticed many changes like manifestation, inflation, and wars, many crises in all over the world. My question is, what was the breaking point for all these crises to start, especially after the COVID? What happened between, in other words, what happened in 2020 and 2021?
Could you maybe just clarify a little bit what the question is?
My question is, I noticed that many crises started after the COVID. What was the breaking point about that?
Okay, are you suggesting that they're all related, or you're looking for a common factor?
A common factor, actually.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. Thank you very much. All right, guys. We have 15 more minutes. There are quite a lot of interesting questions. I know that I will also like to address the African Import-Export Bank and the role of the diaspora and Morocco's presence as an Atlantic state and what that has meant in recalibrating diplomatic contours across the Southern Atlantic in particular. But then there are several others, the issue of adaptation, Greenland, spheres of influence, going back to the status quo, commonality or some tipping point post-COVID. Maybe COVID brought in a lot more than we expected, and it wasn't just a health pandemic. But who's going to go first? Andy, Stefan?
Should I go first? Yeah, you go. Oh, wait, I got one here. Thank you. Really, really important questions and really interesting and so timely. I'm starting with COVID first, actually. I think probably there isn't enough reflection on how COVID was some kind of breaking point. First of all, there was a real sense that Western countries, there wasn't a fair distribution or access to vaccines. Russia and China provided vaccines. Brazil and Indonesia, for example, were vaccinated in the first round by Chinese vaccines. There's a real sense that the kind of any moral authority, I'm not sure if that's the right phrase, but any moral authority the North had about we're all in it together was somehow broken. The contract somehow was broken. Whether the contract was ever that concrete anyway is another question, but somehow COVID took the politics over a threshold. I think the other thing that there isn't enough reflection on is the fiscal constraints in the North and the South are very much driven by the money that had to be spent during COVID. In the North, it's eye-watering. The amounts of money that were spent getting through COVID could have ended world poverty several times over, if you look at the cost of the poverty gap. So I think there's not enough reflection. People often talking about the global financial crisis as the beginning of the breaking point. Actually, I think COVID was much more the kind of threshold moment for political and economic reasons. So let me just respond to some of the other questions. So on the kind of regionalism type question, the African Development Bank, regional organisations, my guess is that development finance is moving towards much more kind of regional basis because it has legitimacy.